Okay, I finished reading the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. I want to say just a few loose comments here and there. As I told my bride when we first turned this thing on, she said, "What are you going to say?" I said, "I don't know. Let's find out." So here's what I do want to say. The whole Sermon on the Mount, I think, is a very fascinating sermon. It's written, it's meant to be read. And if you look at the amount of time it takes approximately 25 plus minutes really to read through it. It's okay. In chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus says this. He says, "I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." And in my view, that's the peg upon which everything in the sermon hangs on. Because what Jesus is talking about is living in his kingdom and what that means. It's a very ethical sermon. In other words, it's a sermon about choices you make to live, the way you choose to live. And the whole goal and the whole point of what Jesus is saying is, my kingdom, when you live for me, when you live as a part of my kingdom, you live it from your heart. You don't live it from your head. This is the problem that the groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Herodians, the Hellenists, the Zealots, and the Essenes, the problem with most every one of those groups, which are different sects of the Jewish religion in that time, they lived their religion from their head. They were very much rule keepers. They were checking the boxes for their righteousness. You know, did I say my prayers today? Check. Did I read some scripture today? Check. Did I do a good deed today? Check. Did I give money to the poor? Check. Did I do some fasting? Check. Did I remember to pay my tithe to the temple? Check. And they would do that. You know, they were very careful about that. Of all the people that were greatly admired by the average Jewish person of Jesus' day, someone who was a Pharisee was highly regarded. The Pharisees took great pains to memorize whole sections of the scripture. They could recite from memory almost the entire 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, from memory. They knew large portions of the Psalms by memory. They knew many of the words of the prophets by memory. They were exceptionally fastidious about doing their good deeds and about doing alms and about praying and about fasting and about going to the temple and about giving sacrifices and about tithing. They were exceptionally fastidious about being moral. But what they forgot was about loving God from their heart and about loving people from their heart. And this is what Jesus' whole point of the entire sermon is all about. Your righteousness cannot be righteousness that's lived in your head. Your righteousness has to exceed the righteousness of Pharisees and the scribes, or else you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. What he means is this has to come from your heart. This has to be what you really live. This has got to come out of here instead of from up here. So it's a very valuable sermon in that regard. If you remember reading through, especially in chapter 5, where Jesus said, "You've heard it once said this, but I say to you this." Because what Jesus is talking about there in that whole section in chapter 5 is not about the rule keeping, but it's about in your heart. Once in Jesus' ministry, he was asked a simple question: what's the greatest commandment? And he said, to love God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. If you forget those things, then you cannot live the righteous life. But if you love God with all your heart and you love your fellow man from your heart, then you don't have to worry about rule keeping. You don't have to worry about checking the boxes to make sure you're a good person. You'll do that automatically. And that's the point of this entire sermon right here. You got to have the righteousness that comes from your heart, not from your head. Rule keeping. That's a problem for a lot of people. A lot of people want to be very religious. Jesus didn't really like religious people, by the way. So when we start getting into chapter 8, which is the next chapter, that's when we're going to find out a few things about what happens in the life of Jesus. Okay? Thank you.